story of Yellow Submarine is one of the lesser known ones in the Beatles' history. People think the Beatles had a lot to do with this animated film, but in reality, that's actually not the case. Now let's flash back to 1964. The Beatles had just signed a film contract with the production company United Artists. Basically, the deal was that the Beatles would have to release 3 films as commitment to their contract. Obviously, the first 2 were A Hard Day's Night and Help, but since the release of Help, the Beatles had turned down script after script because of their constant resemblance to the previous films. Now call the Beatles brand ridiculous if you want, but I'm glad that the band members didn't just do a film for the sake of making money off it. But flash forward now to 1968, and after the idea of an animated feature based on the psychedelic Beatles was brought up, it seems that the Beatles were okay with it, and production on the animated film, entitled Yellow Submarine, was underway. Now this film is legendary in the animation community because of the various techniques it uses. If you look at this film and think, hey, that's like Monty Python, well, you aren't crazy for that comparison because the concept of limited animation would be popularized by this film. Another cool thing we get are the voices themselves, which are not the Beatles but actually replacement voice actors.
Yes, they do look very nice, don't they?
Yes, they do.
They do, though, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Don't they, though?
Do?
Voila, that do.
What's the matter, fellas? Blue meanies?
While you may think that seems like a cop-out, this decision actually pays off with some really great voice acting by the cast. It's so good that George Harrison even stated that it was probably a better decision not to get their own voices on it.
I'm not sure why we never did our own voices, but probably the actors probably did it better anyway. You know, because you needed to be more cartoon-like. I mean, our voices were pretty cartoon-like anyway, but, you know, the exaggeration that you've got with the other actors' voices, I think it suits it.
It really pays off though, considering how wild and wacky the environments are, and while the Beatles weren't involved with actually voicing the characters themselves, they did suggest some ideas that did make it. For example, in the sequence where the Beatles and Captain are plowing through the sea of monsters, there's a monster who sucks everything up with his, vacuum mouth, I don't even know what the heck to call this, which was actually conceptuated by John Lennon. It's quite a strange film the more you think about it, and that's really what the producers wanted. One of the weirdest sequences might just be the Eleanor Rigby sequence, where you see all these models of people doing things like kicking a soccer ball and just sitting around, and it's quite effective because of how surreal the whole picture is, really. As for the writing we get here, it's a massive leap up from the Magical Mystery Tour and Help films, and it's right up there with The Hard Day's Night in terms of how many clever lines of dialogue there is. The basic story is that this group of music-hating creatures, known as the Meanies, take over a land known as Pepperland and prevent anyone from playing music there. One of the survivors, which is that captain I mentioned earlier, drives around in a submarine and picks up the 4 Beatles as they make their way around the sea back to Pepperland, and it's their quest to stop the Meanies. It's a simple story, but to be honest, I think it's far more coherent that way. The problems with Help and Magical Mystery Tour was that they were just simply trying to do too much in hopes of being innovative, while here, they seem to actually be more interested in just telling a story. Obviously, this is because the people who were involved were actually professionals and experienced with this kind of thing. But even when they incorporated ideas from the Beatles, I think they just knew how to fit these sequences in perfectly. Speaking of sequences, the song sequences are really creative and showcase the best of the animation department. The songs themselves obviously are great too, and aside from the songs featured on the soundtrack album, they also use some songs from Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper. So as a whole, this movie was really fantastic and probably the best Beatles film since A Hard Day's Night. While I do prefer A Hard Day's Night because of the Beatles' wit and charm in that film, this one perfectly captures their middle period well. Not to mention that the animation is creative, the characters are great, the story is easy to follow, and the songs are obviously amazing. The last thing to mention about this film is that the Beatles do actually appear at the ending, which I assumed was because they wanted this film to count as part of the contract I mentioned at the beginning, and from what I can gather, it actually did end up counting. Now, the Beatles would release another film that I'll get to in a couple months, but that was actually not tied with the United Artists contract. So Yellow Submarine would really be the last film the Beatles would make with the company. Now to talk about the album. It was released just 2 months after the White Album, which basically showed that the Beatles didn't think of it as a significant release. Considering that some of the songs were recorded right after they had spent months on Sgt. Pepper, it makes sense that the album wasn't viewed in high regard by them. In fact, there wasn't even a concrete time span of sessions dedicated to this album. Songs were periodically recorded from the time span of right after the Pepper sessions to right smack in the range of the White Album. All 4 new songs on the album by Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison weren't really regarded by Lennon-McCartney specifically, and 2 of the songs on the first side already appeared on albums, so already you can tell that the album wasn't entirely new. The real kicker to the album though is side 2. George Martin's composed orchestration for the film actually got made into tracks and put onto side 2, so just as a heads up, when I review this album, I'm going to review all the tracks from side 2 at once, by the way. But let me just say that if you were a Beatles fan back in the day, you might have actually seriously considered whether or not to buy the album itself, with really only 4 new songs by the group appearing on the record. Of course, if you're a diehard fan, you definitely would have purchased it anyways, but otherwise it was really a tough call. And critics weren't too pleased with this album compared to previous releases, and to this day, it's really one of their lowest rated works. It'll definitely be interesting taking a listen to this one, but let's first take a look at the vinyl as usual. This is going to be short because for the first time since Revolver, you don't have a gatefold sleeve. There is a ton of backstory they give you on the back though about the film that does set the stage perfectly going into this album. Derek Taylor, who was their press officer, writes pretty much his first significant piece regarding an album since, geez, Beatles for Sale. I do like the cover here though with the cartoony designs, and I also like the original sleeve from the US edition. But aside from that, there's really nothing else they give you aside from the vinyl itself. So without further ado, let's dive in and take a look at Yellow Submarine. We arrive at Yellow Submarine. Pretty much the iconic song of all our childhoods. I mean, as an adult, it's easy to look at this song and call it quite ridiculous, but I actually think it's a bit more than that, honestly. I mentioned how Yellow Submarine is essentially the prime example of using the studio as an instrument, but this song definitely uses the studio as an instrument itself. I mean, this song has a ton of effects which really enhances its quality. The song is well known as being one of the most simplistic Beatles songs out there, but with all the effects added to it, the song really comes to life. I mean, you get water gurgling sounds, a ship sound effects, and even a segment in the song where John Lennon takes the role of some sailors on the ship. The best part has to be the chorus, which has a giant harmony backing to it, made up of a bunch of people, not just the Beatles themselves, such as Brian Epstein, Mick Jagger, George Harrison's wife Patty Boyd, and a ton of others just contributing vocals to it. It's really a giant sing-along song of sorts, as a result, I can imagine this really being a fun song to sing with the group. Back to looking at it critically though, it's a children's song in genre, and I have to say that it's really amazingly pulled off. I mean, not only are the lyrics fun for children, but they're also fun for adults, with references to the real world thrown in potentially. Now, while I completely believe it's a nonsense song, I don't quite believe that they didn't try to throw in a couple of lines in reflecting their feelings at the time. Now, the last thing to mention is Ringo Starr, who continues the tradition of getting one lead vocal on every Beatles album. As a result, the simplicity of the track definitely makes more sense since he's singing it. So with this track being fun and entertaining, how can you not love it? It's definitely a good song. And while it's quite childish in nature, it has a ton of stuff that really makes it a heck of an enjoyable addition to the album.
Doesn't really matter what chords I play, what words I say, or time of day it is, as it's only a non-song.
The second track on the album is the first new song we get, Only a Northern Song by George Harrison. If you missed the Psychedelia from Magical Mystery Tour, we get a return here. Sort of. This song was actually originated all the way back in the Sgt. Pepper sessions, but was kept off the album because I suppose it just wasn't viewed as up to par with the other compositions that eventually made it on that album. The only thing I can think of is that John and Paul didn't like this song's melody, but I actually think that this one really measures up to some of their compositions on Sgt. Pepper. For starters, George's vocals here are pretty melodic and actually among his better vocal performances, considering that the song was actually a dig at the publishing company Northern Songs, which actually owned all of his compositions. The biggest reason this one is so great though is because of the instrumentation. The organ we get here is a vastly improved organ from Blue Jay Way, mainly because it's in a higher key. And the best parts though are the trumpets, which are actually played by Paul McCartney. It may be surprising to see Paul play an orchestral type of instrument, but if you're a die-hard Beatles fan, you'll know that Paul actually did used to play the trumpet all the way back in the 50s before abandoning it, when he was unable to sing with it. Anyways, Paul goes absolutely insane here, adding one of the strangest instrumental melodies in the Beatles' repertoire. It's essentially like a trumpet orgasm, to put it simply, that basically punctuates every refrain, and what I like most is that it's not the exact same sequence being played every time. This one is honestly really ambitious, and sure, it's not really a consequential Beatles song, but it's still definitely good. George Harrison honestly comes up with a fun and thrilling song here, and while it's not necessarily a classic, it's wacky and fun enough to be quite good.
Together now, all 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 together now.
Following suit is All Together Now, a Paul McCartney composition. If you really miss the simplicity of songs like Ask Me Why and Love Me Do, this song might be the perfect one for you. No rhyme intended. The Beatles already dabbled at a children's song in, well, Yellow Submarine, and they seem to do it again here. Now the lyrics here are probably some of their most simplistic Beatles lyrics I've ever heard, but at the same time there are quite a few laughable lines, such as that Take My Friend to Bed line in the highlights section.
Black, white, green, red, and I take my friend to bed.
Evaluating the song though is difficult because of these lyrics being so simplistic, and even the arrangement itself isn't that complex when I think about it. At the same time though, it's a really fun song and it evokes the classic Beatles sing-along type feeling that songs like Yellow Submarine and Hey Jude did do perfectly. Interestingly enough, both Paul and John sing on this one, which is pretty nice considering their relationship was heading steadily down the toilet at this point. At the end of the day though, I'm gonna have to call this okay. But keep in mind though that the scale really compares the Beatles to themselves, so this song getting an okay is really only because the Beatles already have so many great compositions that just outshine this one. For anyone else though, this would be quite a great one considering the universal message in it. And I'm not gonna lie, I do love this song casually.
You can talk to me. You can talk to me. You can talk to me. If you're lonely, you can talk to me.
Following that one is an almighty gem in Hey Bulldog written by John Lennon. Despite being on a lesser-known Beatles album, there are actually quite a bit of people who do know about how fantastic this tune is. To start things off, it's probably one of the few John Lennon songs to have a really fantastic riff, on the piano let alone. The riff is among their best and immediately grabs you before the guitar mimics it, and the song gets underway and we hear some pretty poetic lyrics from John. Now, while John has claimed that these are nonsense lyrics, I kind of feel that these words perfectly capture the themes and insecurities present in songs like Eleanor Rigby, while mixing in the poetic tone to them via songs like Cry Baby Cry. As a result, the song is filled up with a ton of memorable phrases, so I can imagine that a lot of you might have your own versions of the best line. John's vocal performance here seems to be on pace with songs like Everybody's Got Something to Hide and Twist and Shout, where he has a tremendously sharp timbre to his voice, and it really shows off during the chorus. My favorite part, though, is the ending, where Paul and John both seem to go off after Paul successfully imitates a bulldog, and that apparently ends up impressing John. Now this song is often noted as being created in one of the final sessions to have all four members of the Beatles fully engaged, and the ending does give you that impression. Heading back to the musicianship though, it really is tremendous throughout here, and I can't believe this song wasn't treated better by the group considering all the ways that it impresses in this department alone. Whether it's George Harrison's incredible solo and lead guitar part throughout, Paul McCartney's freaking legendary bass performance in this one that really provides a bopping counter melody throughout, or even that sensational piano work. This song is consistently up in your face and powerful as a really heavy rock song. In terms of heaviest Beatles songs, this one is easily up there with some of the side 3 tracks from the White Album. Not only is it quite heavy like those tracks, but it's also quite good like those tracks. I think that many people really view this as a favorite, and because of how addicting the elements to this one are, it's really a standout on this album as far as original tracks go. I wouldn't be surprised if people who bought the Yellow Submarine LP just buy it just to hear this song, honestly. It truly is a hidden classic. The final original Beatles song on this album is the almighty George Harrison opus, It's All Too Much. George Harrison had pretty much given up on psychedelic drugs after a rough experience in the Haight-Ashbury counterculture area, and this song was really his parting gift to the psychedelic drugs he used. In fact, this is the very last psychedelic Beatles song written by George Harrison to appear on an album. Personally, I think this is as fitting of a swan song as it gets, considering the amazing arrangement this song has. I mean, for starters, we get possibly one of the greatest 10-second openings I've ever heard in a Beatles song musically. That sound you just heard is the same kind of concept that the Beatles applied to songs like I Feel Fine, via using a guitar feedback to create a really howling and eerie sound. In this song though, the emptiness around that echo is what makes the sound particularly memorable for me. It's one of the greatest openings to any Beatles song in my opinion, because it so perfectly sets the stage for what's to come. For those who follow the band Jefferson Airplane, it's actually a very similar effect to the beginning of their 1967 track, The Ballad of Me and You and Pune. And considering that George Harrison visited the birthplace of Jefferson Airplane, which I mentioned was in Haight-Ashbury, I wouldn't be surprised if he was inspired by the intro of that song and wanted to create a similar effect. Anyways, getting back on topic, following that we get a really nice melody played on a church organ before the drums and hand claps take us through a really acidy opening. From the opening get-go, this song is really thick in texture and really harkens back to the days of Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, just based on the production. When the lyrics enter, the parting tone from George that I mentioned earlier really comes into play, with most of his lines really addressing that LSD has worn him out. I do like the way though that George sings these lines, and even the way he writes these lines, because some of these lines are pretty fun. And his voice kind of echoes a sense of departure and fatigue from all the LSD experiences he's gone through. This all builds up throughout the song, by the way, until we reach the climax around the middle with the trumpet melody that really hits close to home for me. I mean, every time I hear that section, I can't help but think how far the Beatles have come because of the influence of drugs amongst other things. The only disappointing thing is that this trumpet melody gets changed in the fade out of the song, and I don't think it punctuates as well as a result. The song itself kind of comes to a halt in terms of the musicianship after that climax, and the last 2 minutes are a little lackluster. We do still get some really nice imagery via the lyrics, and hey, George's vocals are still intimate, but the stillness of the last 2 minutes probably explains why this one didn't really transcend the album for many people like the previous track did. For me personally, I actually believe that similar to how Hey Jude's coda had a lot of great things going on in the background during its long fade out, this song I think still does have some good vocal melodies in the fade out. As a whole though, this song is really excellent. I can't think of a better statement for the Beatles on their psychedelic era than this one. Now, while I said that Magical Mystery Tour was their last psychedelic album, this album has had a few psychedelic tunes to kind of bring a complete closure to that era. With this song, I think it does exactly that, while still being incredibly well produced and exciting at the same time. George Harrison, take a bow.
All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need
the universal anthem All You Need Is Love by John Lennon. This song is an example of a message that really transcends eras because of how universally true it is. You can be cynical and claim that this message is bogus and way too unrealistic like a lot of people have done, but the main source of happiness does come from love, which is what Lennon's essentially trying to say here. What makes me so happy about this song personally is that it was sung on the Our World broadcast, in which 400 million people saw. Think about that. 400 million people around the world saw the Beatles singing All You Need Is Love. It's such a beautiful message and just so powerful. I haven't even gone to the verses yet. While songs like Strawberry Fields were pessimistic and Penny Lane was optimistic, the song is actually both. It depends on how you interpret it, of course. Genius lyrics aside, the musicianship here is once again very unique and interesting. For starters, it features an intro of the beginning of the French national anthem that serves as the universal connection for every country. As a whole, in general, it combines both the orchestral ingredients of songs like Your Mother Should Know with the psychedelic landscape and guitar work of songs like I Am the Walrus and Hello Goodbye to create a heck of a sound. It also follows suit with She Said and Love You Too, featuring a temporary change to another time signature after the first chorus before switching right back. My favorite part personally is the outro with the callback to songs like She Loves You and Yesterday. Certainly good and certainly one of the greatest messages in a song I've ever heard. So now let me talk about side 2, which are all the instrumentals from George Martin. I didn't make any slides for these songs because no Beatle played on any of the tracks, and well, I'm here to talk about them, aren't I? Personally, the George Martin tracks are very well arranged, and they fit alongside brilliantly with the movie, but I really am puzzled on why they crammed all these songs on side 2. None of the songs individually really do much for me, and if they weren't on a Beatles album, I doubt anyone would really pay much attention to them unless you really love George Martin. And now don't get me wrong, I think George Martin is clearly the fifth Beatle, and I'm a huge fan of the way he produces songs. But background music to me is hardly worth really putting on an album like this. Whenever I listen to the Yellow Submarine album, I honestly don't even bother with side 2. Again, they're all very good tracks in the purpose of complementing the scenes in the movie, but on their own, that's where I just personally draw the line. Now the best track was probably Yellow Submarine and Pepperland because of the jubilant orchestration, while The Sea of Holes was rather dull for me to sit through. And as for every other track, they just came and went. So I'm just gonna call the entirety of side 2 okay. While some tracks shined more than others, the overall experience really just left me mixed, honestly. And that wraps up Yellow Submarine. Kind of a quick glance through the album, but in reality that's really about it. Now the album wasn't really treated as a significant release, and personally it barely qualifies as a Beatles studio album. With only 4 original tracks, it's easy to see why many overlook this album when discussing the Beatles' legacy as a whole. Now the pie chart you see is radically impacted by side 2, and we get the first Beatles album to have more okay songs in it than good. In fact, if I didn't count the 2 already released tracks in Yellow Submarine and All You Need Is Love, it wouldn't even be as close as it looks. To be fair though, George Martin's orchestra wasn't necessarily bad or anything, and like I said, it did do its job effectively in the film. However, when you think about listening to an album on its own, these tracks just really feel like a slog to sit through. Anyways, let's head over to the album rankings, and it comes as no surprise I think, but this album takes last place. Now being in last place doesn't mean that this was a bad album, but what it means is that every Beatles album I've compared so far is just far superior. And honestly, when you have a grand total of 4 original tracks to look forward to, it's just really hard to justify it putting ahead of any previous albums. I mean, even in the 2 albums before it, which are Beatles for Sale and With the Beatles, the covers and originals on those albums were still really, new and refreshing. With this album though, a majority of it just feels like tracks were tossed in it. And while it's far from a bad album, this is as mediocre of an album as it gets, to be honest. None of the Beatles really even acknowledge this album too much on their own right, so it just goes to show that this album might just be forgotten about completely despite the really great quality to its original tracks. And speaking of tracks, let's head over to the song rankings, and it's worth mentioning that I didn't include any songs from side 2 because they were really George Martin songs rather than Beatles songs. The songs from side 1 are displayed though, so you can see exactly where I would rank them amongst other tracks. Nothing too exciting, but only a Northern song, Hey Bulldog and It's All Too Much, are the highlights here. Far from the best of the best, but still great enough to be remembered for me. Let's now wrap up with 3 observations I made throughout this album. The first observation is, well, the 4 original tracks, and more specifically the gap to them. Only a Northern song was a product of the Sgt. Pepper sessions. Altogether Now was recorded right before the album was released itself. Hey Bulldog was recorded before the Beatles left for India, and It's All Too Much was recorded in between the Pepper sessions and Magical Mystery Tour sessions. And because of this gap, there's no real identity to the sessions to this album, which are a shame because every Beatles album I've talked about have had concrete sessions dedicated to them. But with this album, it seems to be an exception. The quality was still mostly good, but with this big of a gap, my point about this album not being viewed as a significant release does have a bit more merit to it, don't you think? The next observation I made was George Martin, and in the first 2 videos of this series, if you recall, I talked about George Martin's impact, and I kinda forgot about that until now, but essentially this was really his album to shine. While I think side 2 was a slog to get through, I think George Martin still did a good job of what he had to work with. A lot of the songs on side 2 did have original melodies and interesting instrumentation to them, so George really tried his hardest to make his contributions worthwhile. If you're a fan of George Martin, you might just be shaking your head with how much you've heard me criticize side 2, but trust me when I say that George Martin's importance isn't detailed any more significantly than it is here. And last but not least, this album's place in Beatles history is mostly forgotten. Similar to how Magical Mystery Tour is sandwiched between the most important album ever released in Sgt. Pepper and the gigantic double album in the White Album, this album similarly seems to be faded in the background because around the time this album was released, the Beatles were actually recording what would be the final Beatles album released, You Let It Be. Most of them didn't really pay attention to this album's release, and with the audience already having emptied their pockets on the White Album, not many really wanted to invest in an album like this with only 4 Beatles originals. But as it stands though, I still feel that this album does serve its place in Beatles history. It may be forgotten by many, but the film Yellow Submarine is still a landmark in animation history, and the soundtrack I just talked about did enhance the film. While I stated that Magical Mystery Tour was their last psychedelic album, some actually view this album as that, considering tracks like Only a Northern Song and It's All Too Much. At the end of the day, this album marked the last sign of togetherness for the Beatles in the studio. Next time I'll be talking about Abbey Road, which had very turbulent sessions, despite being regarded by many as the last great Beatles album, and even by some as one of the greatest albums of all time. But thank you all for watching, and with only 2 Beatles albums left to talk about, our time together is nearly coming to an end, similar to the Beatles.